My name is Clara Bennett. I was 26 when I finally understood what it meant to be invisible in a room full of people who shared my blood. The wedding invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it. My younger sister Marissa was getting married, and I already knew what my role would be. Not maid of honor, not even a speaking part in the toast. Just a name on the guest list, tucked somewhere near the back, next to cousins who barely remembered my birthday. I am an architect. Not the kind who designs skyscrapers people photograph from rooftop bars, but the kind who spends years on quiet things, community centers, a library renovation in a town most people couldn't find on a map, a women's shelter with better light and warmer rooms than anyone expected it to have. My mother used to say, gently but pointedly, that I'd settled. My father rarely said anything about my work at all. Marissa was the marketing director at a firm downtown, and every family dinner orbited around her promotions, her office view, her fiancé's family money. I used to correct people when they called me the quiet one. Now I just let it sit. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes trying to choose something that wouldn't draw questions. I picked navy. The navy never draws questions. My mother texted, "Don't be late. And please, no talk about your little building projects tonight. Let's keep the focus on your sister." I read that message twice. Then I put my phone face down on the counter and finished getting dressed in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of every unspoken thing I'd swallowed since I was 17. The venue was a restored estate an hour outside the city, the kind of place with gravel drives and old oak trees that had clearly seen generations of other people's happiest days. I parked at the far end of the lot, near a cluster of pines, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. I thought about the shelter I designed. The morning light hit the east-facing dayroom exactly at 8:40, warming a space where women who had lost everything could sit for a moment and simply be warm. Nobody in my family had ever asked to see it. I stepped out of the car, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the sound of string instruments tuning themselves in the distance, toward a room where, once again, I expected to be seated near the back and forgotten by dessert. I didn't know yet that the man walking the grounds that afternoon, checking sightlines and floor plans with the venue coordinator, was about to change the shape of everything. The ceremony hadn't started yet when I noticed him, a tall, silver-haired man in a charcoal suit, standing near the stone fountain at the edge of the garden, studying the building behind it with the particular stillness of someone who actually sees architecture instead of just standing in it. I recognized the look. I'd worn it myself 1,000 times. I didn't know then that this was Richard Alden, the groom's father, a name that meant very little to me at the time beyond wealthy, which was the only detail my mother had bothered to mention in the weeks leading up to the wedding, usually followed by a comment about how well Marissa had married up. He was tracing the roofline with his eyes when I passed him, and without quite meaning to, I said, "They restored the original trusses. You can tell by the joinery, nobody builds like that anymore." He turned, mildly surprised that anyone had spoken to him at all, let alone about trusses. "You know buildings." "I designed them," I said. "Community spaces, mostly. Nothing anyone photographs." "Everything gets photographed eventually," he said. "The question is whether anyone remembers why it mattered." I almost laughed, a short, startled sound, because it was the first thing anyone had said to me all week that felt like it was actually meant for me, not for the version of me my family preferred. We talked for maybe 4 minutes before the coordinator called him away. For minutes about cantilevers and community and how the best buildings disappear into the lives of the people who use them. He asked my name. I told him. He didn't recognize it, and I didn't expect him to. I found my seat, 3rd row from the back, as anticipated, and watched my sister walk down the aisle in a dress that cost more than the annual maintenance budget of the shelter I'd built. My mother dabbed her eyes. My father beamed with the specific pride he reserved for milestones that could be explained at dinner parties. I clapped when everyone clapped. I smiled when the photographer swept past our row. I told myself, as I always did, that this was fine, that I didn't need recognition to know my work mattered. But some nights fine wear thin. And that night, sitting in navy in the 3rd row from the back, something in me had already begun, quietly, to shift. I had no idea that Richard Alden had asked the coordinator, almost in passing, who the woman by the fountain was, and that by morning, that question would find its way to the head table. Dinner passed in the usual rhythm, clinking glasses, distant laughter, my mother's voice carrying across the table every time someone mentioned Marissa's new title. I ate slowly. I watched the candlelight move across the tablecloth and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of relief. Then Richard Alden stood to give his toast. I expected the standard sentiment, love, family, wishes for a long marriage. Instead, halfway through, he paused, looked out over the tables, and said something that made the room go very still. Before I finish, I want to mention something unrelated to the wedding, if you'll indulge an old man. A small, warm laugh from the crowd. Earlier today, I was admiring this venue's restoration, and I had the pleasure of speaking with a young woman who clearly understood exactly what made this building work. It turns out she's not just a guest here. She's an architect. Clara Bennett. Some of you may know her. My fork stopped halfway to my plate. I asked around, he continued, because I've spent 30 years in commercial development, and I don't often meet people who talk about buildings the way she does, like they're meant to hold people, not just impress them. I looked up her portfolio this afternoon. The Ashford Women's Shelter. The Denny Street Library renovation. Extraordinary work. Quiet work. The kind that doesn't ask for applause but deserves it anyway. I felt the heat rise in my face before I understood why. Not embarrassment, exactly. Something closer to disbelief. My mother's expression flickered, a brief crack in her composure, quickly smoothed over. My father set down his glass very carefully, the way people do when they're recalculating something in real time. Marissa, radiant in white, glanced at me from the head table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or something older than surprise. I mention this, Richard said, raising his glass again, because my company has been searching for an architect for a community project we've been quietly developing for 2 years, and I didn't expect to find her at my son's wedding. Clara, if you're willing, I'd like to talk business next week. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real, and it wasn't for Marissa, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, it was for me. I didn't smile the way people expected. I just sat very still, the way you do when something you'd stop hoping for finally, quietly, arrives. My mother didn't speak until we were in the parking lot, gravel crunching under her heels, her clutch bag held tight against her side like armor. Well, she said. That was unexpected. I didn't answer right away. I was still holding the moment in my hands, turning it over, not yet ready to let anyone else touch it. You could have told us you were doing work like that, my father said, not quite looking at me. The shelter. The library. We didn't know it was. He stopped, searching for a word that wouldn't cost him anything. Significant. I told you, I said quietly. Every year, at every dinner, when you asked what I was working on, you just never asked a second question. Silence settled over the car like dust. My mother turned to look out the window. We didn't want to make Marissa's night about you. I didn't make it about me, I said. He did. Because he asked, and I answered honestly, and apparently that was enough. I thought about all the dinners where I'd mentioned a project and watched my mother's eyes drift toward Marissa before I'd finished a sentence. All the years I'd learned to make myself smaller at that table, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because saying it never seemed to land anywhere. I'm not trying to take anything from her, I said finally. I never was. I just stopped expecting anyone here to notice what I built, because for a long time nobody did. My father exhaled slowly, the sound of a man realizing, too late, that he'd been measuring the wrong things. We should have asked more questions. It wasn't quite an apology. It was something smaller, more honest, an acknowledgement, offered without performance, in the dark of a car on a gravel road. I didn't need it to be more than that. I'd stopped needing my family's math to add up in order to know my own worth. When we pulled into my driveway, my mother reached over, briefly, and touched my hand. Send me a picture of the shelter sometime, she said. I'd like to see it. It wasn't everything, but it was the first real door that had opened between us in years, and I decided, quietly, to walk through it, not for her sake, but for mine. Richard Alden called on Tuesday, Exactly as he'd promised, no assistant, no delay, just his own voice on the line asking if I had 20 minutes. I did. He described the project carefully, a mixed-income housing development anchored by a community health clinic in a neighborhood that had been promised revitalization for a decade and received mostly demolition instead. He wanted it built by people who understood that a building could either dignify a community or quietly insult it, depending on 100 small decisions nobody outside the profession would ever notice. I've had firms twice your size pitch me glass atriums and rooftop gardens, he said. None of them asked who actually lives there. You would. I thought of every unpaid extra hour I'd spent at the shelter, adjusting a hallway width so 2 wheelchairs could pass, without one person having to press themselves against the wall. Nobody had asked me to do that. I'd done it because it mattered, quietly, to no audience at all. I'd want to spend time in the neighborhood before I drew anything, I told him. Actual time. Not a site visit, weeks. Good, he said. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. We spoke for almost an hour. Not once did he mention my sister, my family, or the wedding. He talked about trusses and light and dignity, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit, the particular relief of being taken seriously without having to fight for it first. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, looking at the framed photograph on my wall. The shelter, taken the week it opened, empty rooms waiting to be filled with people's lives. I remembered standing in that doorway at the ribbon cutting while my mother texted to say she couldn't make it because of a work dinner for Marissa's promotion. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and more durable than triumph, the sense that the work itself had finally spoken for me, in a room where I had almost given up expecting anyone to listen. I called my father that evening not because I needed to, but because I wanted to try. I got the project, I said. There was a pause, and then, for the first time in years, real warmth in his voice.
Tell me about it.
All of it. I want to understand what you do. I did. And for once, no one interrupted to change the subject back to Marissa. 6 months later, I stood at the edge of a cleared lot in a part of the city most developers had written off, holding a folder of blueprints that represented 18 years of learning how to listen to buildings before I ever put a pencil to paper. Richard Alden stood beside me, hands in his coat pockets, watching the excavators begin their slow work. Nervous? He asked. Always, I said. If I'm not nervous, I'm not paying enough attention. He laughed, a low, genuine sound. That's the answer of someone who's going to do this for a very long time. My mother came to the groundbreaking. She stood a little awkwardly at the edge of the small gathered crowd, unsure of the etiquette for a ceremony that wasn't about weddings or promotions, but she came, and when the local news reporter asked her how she felt about her daughter's project, she said, proud, without hesitation, and I let myself believe her. Marissa sent a text that morning. Saw the article. It looks incredible, Clara. I should have asked more about your work over the years.
I'm sorry.
I didn't need a grand reconciliation. I texted back a single line, thank you for saying that, and meant it completely, without needing the moment to be bigger than it was. I thought about the version of myself who used to sit in the third row from the back at every family gathering, rehearsing ways to make her accomplishments sound smaller, so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone else's spotlight. That version of me had done nothing wrong. She had simply been waiting for a room that was ready to hear her. Now I stood in a different kind of room, an open lot under an open sky, holding blueprints for a clinic that would, in 18 months, hold a community's quiet, unphotographed, essential moments, a mother waiting with a sick child, an elderly man collecting his prescriptions, a teenager filling out a form for the first job of his life. Nobody would applaud any of that. And for the first time, I understood that this had never been what I was working for. There is a particular silence that exists inside an unfinished building. No furniture, no people, just structure and light finding its way through window frames that don't have glass yet. I've always loved that silence more than any finished room, because it's the moment before a building decides what kind of life it's going to hold. I walked through the clinic skeleton alone one evening, after the crew had gone home, running my hand along a stud wall that would, in a few months, be a hallway wide enough for 2 wheelchairs to pass without either person flinching toward the wall. I thought about the wedding, the navy dress, the third row from the back. My mother's text asked me not to talk about my little building projects. I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger had visited, briefly, in the weeks after the wedding. A hot, righteous flare that wanted an apology large enough to match years of feeling unseen. But anger, I'd learned, made poor blueprints. It didn't build anything that lasted. What I felt instead, standing in that unfinished hallway, was something closer to clarity. My family hadn't seen my work because they hadn't known how to look, not because the work wasn't worth seeing. Richard Alden hadn't given me anything I didn't already have. He'd simply been the first person outside my own head to say the sentence I'd needed to hear for years. This matters, and I see it. I understood, finally, that I didn't need my family to say it too, in order for it to be true. Their recognition, when it came, clumsy, delayed, imperfect, was a gift I could accept without needing it to complete me. I ran my palm along the rough plywood subfloor, feeling the small vibrations of a building settling into its bones, and thought about the woman who would walk through that door in a year with a child running a fever, and how the light from the east window would fall across the waiting room floor at exactly the right hour to make the space feel less like an emergency and more like a place that expected her, that had been built with her specifically in mind. That was the applause I had always been working for. It had simply taken me 26 years, one wedding, and one stranger's honest question to understand that I already had it. The clinic opened on a bright October morning, nearly 2 years after a man I barely knew paused beside a fountain to ask who had designed the building behind it. My family came. All of them. My mother wore a soft gray coat and stood near the front, and when the ribbon was cut, I caught her wiping her eyes, not performing emotion for anyone watching, just quietly, privately moved, in a way I hadn't seen from her in years. Marissa hugged me afterward, longer than either of us expected. "I used to think your work was the safe choice," she said, "the thing you did because you didn't want the pressure I chose. I was wrong. This is harder than anything I do. And it matters more."
I didn't need her to say that.
But hearing it, freely given, without me having to earn it through one more toast or one more stranger's intervention, settled something in me that had been unsettled for a very long time. Richard Alden found me near the end of the ceremony, watching a young mother walk through the front doors for the first time, her daughter tugging at her sleeve to look at the mural in the waiting room, a wall of hand-painted light I'd insisted on, over budget objections, because I remembered what it felt like to walk into rooms that had clearly been designed without me in mind. "You built something your family finally understood," he said. "That's rare." "They didn't build it," I said. "They just finally saw it. There's a difference." He nodded, like he understood exactly what I meant. I stood at the edge of the crowd as the doors opened fully and the first families walked through, into a building shaped by every quiet, unrewarded hour I'd spent believing my work mattered before anyone else agreed. The light fell exactly where I designed it to fall, warming the waiting room floor the way morning light always finds a way into rooms built with care. I didn't need the room to remember my name. I only needed to know, standing there in the doorway of something I had made with my own hands and years of unspoken patience, that I had never been invisible at all. I had simply been waiting for the right light to fall.